Picture this. You step outside, and within 60 seconds, the exposed skin on your face starts dying. Not stinging, not burning. Actually dying. The moisture in your eyes begins to freeze before you can blink it away. The air feels like broken glass pouring into your lungs. And somewhere out in that darkness, because there is no sun, there hasn't been a sun in 3 months, something moves. You can't see it. You can't hear it above the wind. But you know it's there because in a place like this, the things that survive are not small. This is Alert, Canada, the northernmost permanently inhabited settlement on the entire planet. And for decades, what happened here has been locked behind layers of military secrecy, human tragedy, and forces of nature so violent they strain the limits of physics. But here's what nobody talks about. This frozen wasteland, this place most people couldn't even find on a map, may be the single most strategically important piece of real estate on Earth right now. Not because of what's buried beneath it, not because of what lives in its waters, but because of what's happening to it. The ice is melting. And the moment that ice disappears completely, everything changes. The global economy changes. The balance of military power changes. The map of the world, in a very real sense, changes. So let's go there. Let's understand what this place actually is, what was done there in the name of national interest, what the ice has been hiding, and why the most powerful nations on the planet are quietly, desperately scrambling to control it before anyone else gets there first. Alert sits at 82 degrees north latitude. To understand how far north that is, consider this. If you took the entire continental United States and stacked it on top of itself moving northward from the Canadian border, you still wouldn't reach Alert. It sits less than 900 kilometers from the geographic North Pole itself. There are no roads connecting it to the rest of civilization. No highway, no rail line, no bridge. The only way in or out is by aircraft, and only when the weather permits, which in winter is essentially never. The cold there operates on a different physics than cold anywhere else. When temperatures drop to minus 40, minus 50, minus 60 Celsius, ordinary materials begin to behave in ways that feel impossible. Take a steel, crowbar outside on a bad January morning and strike it against a rock, and it will shatter. Not bend, shatter the way glass shatters, spraying fragments across the frozen ground. The molecular bonds that make steel strong become brittle when they lose enough thermal energy. The metal becomes glass. Standard thermometers don't work there. Mercury, the liquid metal that most thermometers rely on, has a freezing point of minus 38 Celsius. At Alert, in the dead of winter, a mercury thermometer doesn't read the temperature. It just shows you a small frozen ball sitting at the bottom of the tube. Everything there runs on alcohol-based instruments, on specialized equipment designed for a world most people never experience. Leave your car engine off for an hour in that cold, and you won't be driving anywhere that morning. The oil in the crankcase transforms into something with the consistency of wet concrete. The rubber in your tires freezes in exactly the shape they were sitting. So when you finally start the engine and try to roll forward, you're not riding on round tires. You're riding on flat-sided polygons, bouncing down the road until enough friction warms the rubber back into something resembling a circle, assuming the engine started at all. Water supply in Alert comes from a frozen lake through an insulated, continuously heated pipe. If that pump stops working, mechanical failure, power outage, anything, and thus, the system freezes solid within a matter of hours. And in a place where the outside temperature can kill an unprotected person in minutes, losing heat and water isn't an inconvenience. It's a death sentence. The entire infrastructure of the base exists on a razor's edge, kept alive by generators, by maintenance schedules, by the constant vigilance of the people stationed there who understand that in this place, complacency kills. For years, people outside the military have speculated about why Canada would spend the kind of money required to maintain a base in a location this hostile. The cost of supplying Alert is staggering. Every kilogram of food, every liter of fuel, every spare part for every machine has to arrive by aircraft. There are no resupply ships in winter. There are no trucks. There's just the thin aluminum skin of a military transport plane holding back the vacuum of the Arctic sky, carrying the supplies that keep roughly 100 people alive in the most inhospitable environment on Earth. So what's worth that kind of expense? The internet has had its theories, as it always does. Underground bunkers designed to survive nuclear war, secret facilities housing debris from unknown aircraft. The kind that didn't crash because of mechanical failure. Weather manipulation systems capable of generating storms on the other side of the planet. These theories share a common thread. They all assume that the isolation of Alert means something extraordinary is being hidden there. The truth is more mundane and, in its own way, more fascinating. Alert is an ear, the largest, most sophisticated listening post in the world's most strategically perfect location. The base exists to intercept electronic signals, military communications, encrypted transmissions, radar signatures, satellite telemetry from across the entire northern hemisphere. And the reason it works so well comes down to pure geometry. Look at a standard flat map of the world, and the Arctic looks like dead space at the top, a frozen fringe connecting the edges of continents nobody cares about. But look at a globe, actually look at a sphere, and the Arctic is something else entirely. It's the shortest path between North America and Eurasia. Any missile launched from Russia toward North America travels over the Arctic. Any signal transmitted between those two regions passes through Arctic airspace. Any submarine trying to move between the Atlantic and Pacific without passing through contested straits has to go north. Alert sits at the center of all of this. Its arrays of antennas and radar dishes pull in signals from thousands of kilometers in every direction. The personnel stationed there, working in rotating shifts, because no one can physically or psychologically survive more than a few months at a time, are listening to the electromagnetic heartbeat of nations. They know when a military aircraft takes off on the other side of the world. They know when a submarine activates its systems. They know things that never appear in any public briefing, because the raw information flowing into Alert never stops. But Alert's story, as extraordinary as it is not the most troubling chapter in the history of Canada's Arctic presence. For that, you need to travel a few hundred kilometers to a place called Grise Fjord. It's the summer of 1953. A government vessel approaches a group of Inuit families living along the shores of Hudson Bay. Officials come ashore with promises and pamphlets and the particular kind of cheerful authority that precedes every decision made on behalf of people who weren't asked. The families are told that the government has identified magnificent land to the north, rich hunting grounds, caribou by the thousands, seal and fish so abundant that life there will be easy, prosperous, secure. The government will provide housing. The government will provide support. This is an opportunity, the officials say, an adventure, a chance for something better. The families pack what they own, dogs, tents, tools, children. They board the ship in good faith, because what choice do families have when their government arrives with promises and authority? The ship travels north for weeks, and when it finally stops and the gangway comes down, the people walk off onto something that does not match a single word they were told. There are no caribou. There's no abundant game. There's black rock and permanent ice and the beginning of a polar winter that will last 4 months without a single hour of sunlight. The ship turns around and leaves. The families are standing on the shore of Ellesmere Island with whatever they carried off the boat, watching the vessel disappear over the horizon, facing a winter that would have been genuinely unthinkable to anyone who hadn't spent generations adapting to the Arctic. Even then, even with that generational knowledge, what they faced was extreme. They dug into snow for shelter. They searched frozen shorelines for any scrap of driftwood. They survived through nothing but the accumulated knowledge of their ancestors, and a refusal to accept what the situation was suggesting about their odds. When the details of what happened at Grise Fjord began emerging in the press decades later, the reaction was what you'd expect. People wanted a sinister explanation, medical experiments, survival research and preparation, for some other mission. A deliberate culling of a population the government no longer wanted to deal with. The human mind looks for active malice when passive indifference would explain things just as well, because passive indifference is somehow even harder to accept. The actual reason was devastatingly simple and completely without excuse. Canada, like every Arctic nation in the post-war years, was suddenly aware that the international law governing territorial claims required actual human habitation, not flags, not survey missions, not occasional research. Expeditions. People living there continuously, year-round. The Canadian government looked at the map, identified the areas it wanted to claim before anyone else did, and asked itself what the cheapest, easiest way to put people there would be. The answer it arrived at was to use Inuit families as living territorial markers, to transplant human beings into the harshest environment in their country and call it a settlement program. The families at Grise Fjord were not citizens being relocated for their benefit. They were instruments of foreign policy. They were flags made of flesh, planted in the ice to establish a legal claim. Canada formally apologized for this in 2010, 57 years after the ship turned around. If the human cost of Arctic ambition has a face, it belongs to the men and women aboard Box Top 22, October 1991, a Canadian Forces CC-130 Hercules transport aircraft on a routine resupply mission to Alert. 18 people, 1,000 liters of fuel. Cargo, mail probably. The small things that keep morale alive in a place designed to destroy it. The flight is going normally until it isn't. The crew can see the runway lights at Alert directly ahead. The approach looks clean. And then the storm that had been building on the edge of the radar swallows everything in a single moment. What pilots call a whiteout, a phenomenon that doesn't just reduce visibility, but eliminates it in a fundamentally different way than fog or darkness does. In a normal whiteout, the problem is that you can't see far enough. But in a true Arctic whiteout, during a heavy snowstorm with no shadows and uniform white light from every direction, the problem is that you can't perceive depth at all. The sky and the ground become one continuous white surface. The horizon disappears, not because it's obscured, but because it literally ceases to exist as a visual distinction. Pilots who have survived whiteout experiences describe the sensation as trying to land a plane inside a ping pong ball. Everything is white. Everything is equally bright. There is no up, there is no down, there is no forward, there is only white. The Hercules flew into a ridge at 30 kilometers from the runway. Not in a spin, not in a stall, in level flight. The aircraft was doing exactly what it was supposed to be doing on a normal approach, and it flew straight into terrain that its crew simply could not see. The fuselage broke apart on impact. Survivors were thrown into the open, onto the ice, in the dark, in a blizzard, at temperatures approaching minus 30. No shelter. 4, some of them, inadequate clothing. The base at alert received the distress signal immediately. They knew exactly where the crash site was, approximately. They could hear the survivors on the radio. They were 30 kilometers away, and they couldn't reach them for more than 30 hours. The wind during an Arctic storm is not like wind anywhere else. It doesn't blow, it presses. It's a physical force that can knock a person off their feet on an open expanse of flat ground. Rescue teams from alert attempted repeatedly to reach the crash site, and were turned back each time by conditions that made forward movement physically impossible. For over a day, people who knew that survivors were out there on the ice had to wait while the storm decided when it was done. 5 people died. The ones who survived did so through a combination of luck, improvisation, and the ruthless biological calculus of a body deciding which parts of itself it can afford to save and which it will sacrifice to keep the core alive. But Alert's story has another dimension that most people don't know about, one that has nothing to do with military missions or supply flights. It has to do with what happens inside a human mind when you remove almost everything that mind expects to receive. Imagine the end of October arriving as it does everywhere else. Trees losing their leaves, daylight getting shorter. Now imagine that this process doesn't stop. The days don't just get short. They get shorter and shorter. Until one morning, and this is not a metaphor, this is a thing that actually happens. The sun rises for about 2 minutes and then sets again. And the next day, it doesn't rise at all. And it won't rise again until February. The personnel at alert during the polar winter are confined. Not metaphorically confined, not restricted in the suburban sense of there not being much to do on a Tuesday evening. They are genuinely unable to go outside for extended periods because the combination of cold, wind, and disorientation in total darkness creates conditions where a person can wander fatally off course within 100 meters of where they started. There are polar bears. There's machinery that operates at temperatures where an unprotected hand pressed against a metal surface will stick to it and tear when you pull away. So people stay inside, in the same rooms, with the same people, eating the same food, hearing the same mechanical drone of generators that never stop because stopping means death, week after week. And then strange things start to happen. Experienced personnel, not inexperienced recruits, not people with prior psychological issues, but trained, vetted, psychologically evaluated professionals begin reporting things. Peripheral figures that disappear when looked at directly. Voices using their names coming from directions where no one is standing. The sensation that the walls of a room are closer than they were yesterday, moving with glacial slowness toward a collision that never arrives. The scientific explanation for this is solid and well documented. The human brain is not designed to operate in sensory conditions this sparse for this long. Under normal conditions, the brain is constantly processing a flood of novel information, new faces, changing. Light, outdoor smells, the sound of wind in trees, the subconscious read of a stranger's posture across a room. All of that input serves a regulatory function. It grounds the brain in shared reality by constantly providing external reference points. Remove those reference points for months, and the brain does what any sufficiently complex system does when it stops receiving input. It starts generating its own. The visual cortex, accustomed to interpreting shadows and movement, begins finding patterns in uniform environments. The auditory system, trained to recognize meaningful sounds against background noise, starts identifying signals in the hiss of ventilation systems. It's not weakness. It's not pathology. It's the brain doing exactly what it's built to do, construct a coherent model of reality with inadequate materials. Add to this the complete destruction of circadian rhythm. The internal clock that tells a human body when to sleep and when to be alert runs primarily on light cues. Take away all light for 4 months, and the clock doesn't stop. It drifts. People find themselves genuinely exhausted at noon and wide awake at 3 in the morning, not because they chose those hours, but because their biology has lost its anchor. The boundary between dreaming and waking becomes permeable, And in that permeability, things appear that have no business appearing in a military installation 30 degrees from the North Pole. And then there are the sounds that come from beneath the ice. Those are different. In the fall of 2016, Inuit hunters working the waters around the northern Canadian islands noticed something was wrong before they understood what it was. The channels they worked, normally alive with ringed seals, bearded seals, walrus, bowhead whales, were empty, not depleted, not quiet, empty, with a sudden completeness that suggested not gradual depletion, but a mass evacuation. Animals that had been in those waters for as long as anyone could remember were simply gone. Then the hunters began feeling something rather than hearing it. A low-frequency pulse, rising through the holes of aluminum boats, through the soles of rubber boots pressed, against frozen ground. Not a sound so much as a physical pressure, a vibration that the human auditory system sits right on the edge of perceiving. Consistent, rhythmic in a mechanical way, like something enormous turning at depth. A sound that didn't stop, that continued for weeks. The Canadian military took this with full seriousness. Patrol aircraft were diverted, acoustic buoys, the kind dropped to detect enemy submarines, were deployed across the affected area. The seafloor was mapped with care. When the analysis came back, the explanation was real, and it was not reassuring because what it described was an acceleration in the destruction of one of the oldest geological features on the planet. The Arctic sea ice is not a uniform sheet. Parts of it are ancient. Glaciers and ice shelves that have been continuous features of the ocean for thousands of years, grounded on the seafloor in places, floating in others, but stable across the span of human civilization, or stable until recently. The buoys detected a glacier, a piece of ice the size of a small city in terms of mass, moving, sliding off the underwater shelf it had rested on for millennia, and dragging across the rock of the seafloor. Imagine a piece of dense foam the size of a building, pulled slowly across wet glass, and now scale that up by a factor of 100 million in terms of mass. The friction produces sound at frequencies that travel efficiently through seawater, frequencies that sit right in the range used by marine mammals for communication, navigation, and echolocation. Whales navigate by sound. Seals hunt by sound. When a glacier begins grinding across a sea floor at low frequency and the ocean fills with that noise, marine mammals in the area experience something equivalent to a person trying to have a conversation inside a jet engine. They leave. They don't come back until it stops. The military's conclusion was straightforward and deeply unsettling. They were listening to the infrastructure of the Arctic unmake itself. Which brings us to the reason none of this is just history. None of this is just a story about cold and hardship and a few unusual things that happened in a remote location that doesn't affect most people's lives. The reason alert matters today, the reason countries with no territorial claims anywhere near the Arctic are suddenly building Arctic-capable fleets and training Arctic-capable soldiers and filing claims under international maritime law for Arctic seafloor is that the ice is going. Not gradually, not in the way that geological changes usually happen, so slowly that no human lifetime contains enough of the curve to feel alarmed. The change happening in the Arctic right now is measurable in years. Passages that required icebreakers as recently as a decade ago are navigable by ordinary commercial vessels for portions of the year. The extent of sea ice at summer minimum has dropped consistently over 3 decades of satellite observation. The trend is not ambiguous. And when the ice goes, what it reveals is something that geopolitics has been quietly going mad over for 20 years. The Northwest Passage, the route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the Canadian Arctic archipelago, is the kind of thing that killed explorers for 400 years. From the 1490s to the early 1900s, ship after ship went north looking for it, and either turned back or didn't come back at all. The ones that found it frozen, locked in ice, unusable. That route, if it becomes reliably navigable for modern cargo vessels, cuts the shipping time between Asia and Europe by approximately 2 weeks. Not 2 hours. 2 weeks. In a world where the largest container ships carry goods worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and where fuel represents a massive portion of operating cost, 2 weeks is transformative. It doesn't just save money, it redistributes the economic geography of global trade. It makes some ports more important and others less. It changes which countries sit at the center of commerce and which sit at the margins. Every major shipping nation on Earth has done the math, and the answer they all arrived at is the same. Whoever controls the Northwest Passage controls something enormously valuable. Canada's position is that the Northwest Passage runs through internal Canadian waters, that Canada has the sovereign right to regulate transit through that passage, to collect fees, to impose conditions, to close it entirely in the national interest. Other countries, notably the United States and historically the Soviet Union, have maintained that it's an international strait that all nations have the right to transit freely. This is not a theoretical dispute. It has generated formal diplomatic protests and actual maritime confrontations. Alert, in this context, is not just a listening post, it's a presence. It's a reminder that Canada is watching every vessel that enters those waters, tracking every submarine, monitoring every attempted transit. The technology there has evolved from Cold War radio interception into something far more sophisticated. A real-time picture of the Arctic operating environment maintained around the clock by people willing to live in conditions that most of us couldn't survive for a week. The irony that runs through all of this is heavy enough to feel. The same process that's creating the commercial opportunity in the Arctic, the warming that's melting the ice and opening the passage, is also the process that put that grinding, haunting sound into the water in 2016. The same warming that's making Alert more strategically important is also making the place more difficult in new ways, as permafrost that buildings have stood on for decades begins to shift and soften. The Inuit families moved to Grise Fjord in 1953 to anchor a territorial claim are still there. Their descendants are still there. They live in the consequences of a decision made on their behalf by people who saw them as planet. The irony of that doesn't resolve. It just sits there in the cold like everything else. What we've traced here is something that starts in the physics of extreme cold and ends in the economics of global trade, passing through military strategy, psychological breakdown, human rights catastrophe, and the slow-motion transformation of a geological feature that has been stable for longer than civilization has existed. Alert and Grise Fjord aren't anomalies. They're the leading edge of something much larger. A contest for position in a world being remade by forces that no nation controls, and all of them are scrambling to exploit. The Arctic doesn't care about any of this, of course. It doesn't care about shipping lanes or territorial claims or signal interceptions or the psychological welfare of the people it slowly unmakes. It's just cold. Brutally, indifferently, incomprehensibly cold. And in that cold, in the dark, in the grinding of ancient ice against ancient rock, something is happening that will matter to everyone on Earth, whether they ever set foot within 1,000 miles of it or not. There's a particular kind of hubris in the human relationship with extreme environments, and the Arctic is probably the most clarifying example of it on the planet. We have spent generations going to places we were never designed to survive, building things there, making claims there, sending people there who come back, changed in ways that don't fully reverse. We developed technology sophisticated enough to intercept encrypted military transmissions from halfway around the world, and then deployed that technology in a location where the primary challenge on some days is simply keeping the pipes from freezing. We wrote international law to govern territorial claims, and then used that law to justify transplanting families into an environment that nearly killed them. We built aircraft capable of navigating through almost any weather, and then discovered that the Arctic could generate conditions those aircraft couldn't survive. And through all of it, the ice kept doing what ice does. It expanded in winter and retreated in summer, kept the Northwest Passage frozen, maintained the geological stability of features that had been there since before human beings existed. It was the constant in every equation, the thing that made the Arctic simultaneously inhospitable and navigable only by those who had spent generations learning its rhythms, the thing that made Alert necessary and Grise Fjord survivable, the thing that made the sounds in 2016 possible and the military's listening arrays effective. Now that constant is changing. The single most stabilizing element of the entire Arctic equation is removing itself from the equation. And what's being revealed underneath isn't just open water and new shipping routes, though those are real and their implications are enormous. What's being revealed is a region whose governance was built around assumptions that no longer hold. International agreements about who controls what in the Arctic were negotiated in a world where most of the Arctic was permanently inaccessible. When accessibility is no longer the constraint it was, when ordinary commercial vessels can transit passages that only military icebreakers could once force, the legal and diplomatic architecture built around the old reality becomes inadequate almost overnight. Countries are already positioning themselves. Russia has been rebuilding Arctic military infrastructure for over a decade, reopening bases that were shuttered after the Cold War, developing new classes of nuclear-powered icebreakers, asserting expanded claims over Arctic seafloor under provisions of international maritime law. China, which has no Arctic territory at all, has declared itself a near-Arctic state, and invested heavily in research presence there, understanding that observer status today can translate into influence tomorrow. Norway and Denmark and other Arctic border nations are watching their maritime neighborhoods transform in real time, dealing with increased vessel traffic, contested boundaries, and the particular anxiety of being small countries in a neighborhood that large powers have decided matters. The United States, for its part, maintains Alert's Canadian counterpart through a series of joint North American defense arrangements, continues to contest Canada's position on the status of the Northwest. Passage is internal waters, and has been modernizing its northern radar networks after years of relative neglect. The gap between where American Arctic capabilities were at the end of the Cold War and where they are now represents decades of assumptions that the Arctic would remain frozen and therefore strategically secondary. Those assumptions are now being corrected at significant cost and under time pressure, all of which circles back to that small, brutal place at 82 degrees north latitude. Alert was built for one world and has survived into a completely different one. The Cold War. Listening Post, designed to monitor Soviet military communications, now monitors commercial shipping, sovereign government vessels, and the movements of ice itself. The base that was once defined primarily by its isolation now sits at the center of one of the busiest strategic conversations on Earth. The people who rotate through it, who eat the same food in the same mess hall, who hear the generators at 3 a.m, who occasionally see things in the corridors that shouldn't be there, are doing something more consequential than they may realize while they're doing it. They're holding a position. In a world where the definition of that position is changing faster than the policy designed to govern it, they are the human presence in a place that humanity is only now beginning to understand it cannot afford to abandon. The frozen edge of the world is melting, and the world isn't ready for what comes next.